So I stopped talking about self-care, and now I talk about essential maintenance, because if you don't look after yourself, if you don't do the bare minimum, you cannot carry on, and then you cannot meet your children's needs, let alone your own. So because I ignored my overwhelm, which is, it was overwhelming. My life was very, very difficult. I had 2 strokes.
Welcome to Care Vision's Family Talk, a space dedicated to exploring the challenges of raising children in today's world. I'm Lucy Johnston. Each episode, I chat with a guest and we dive into the real-life struggles faced by children and their carers, offering insights and practical guidance to help families feel understood, supported, and hopeful. Whether you're a parent, foster carer, grandparent, or anyone supporting the young people in your life, this is the place for you. More children than ever are struggling with behaviour, anxiety, and emotional regulation. But behind that behaviour, there is often a story. So how should we respond, and what actually works? I'm Lucy Johnston, and this is Family Talk, and I'm delighted to welcome Sarah Naish, one of the country's leading experts in therapeutic parenting, a former social worker and foster carer. Now, hi Sarah, it's brilliant to have you on Family Talk. You've fostered, is that right, about 5 children over your career? And
I did foster, but then I adopted 5 children. So the 5 comes in with my adopted children, who are all now adults.
Wow. That's, yes, a bit more than busy, I think, full stretch. So, but just thinking, just initially, just so that people understand, but how that shaped your understanding of behaviour, and not only of children, but of you yourself as a person every day.
Sure. Well, before I adopted my children, I had trained as a nursery nurse. Super nanny had nothing on me, and that's the kind of parenting I did, standard parenting, and I then became a social worker. So by the time I adopted my children, I had fostered other children. I had qualified as a social worker, and I've been working in children and families. And when my children moved in with me, after about 3 months later, I realised I didn't have a clue. I didn't know about this. I didn't know about the effect that trauma has on behaviours. I didn't know it as a social worker. I didn't know it as a nursery nurse. And there was this kind of dawning realisation that not only do a lot of people not know about this, but you're on your own. There's a lot of isolation. So, yeah, that's how my children taught me everything I know, basically.
Well, when you say you didn't have a clue, what do you mean by that? How did that sort of manifest? Do you really think you didn't have a clue?
Yeah, well, I always say to people that if you have parented before and you've done standard parenting, you've looked after securely attached children, the only transferable skills really, if you're going to look after children from trauma, are you know how to use a washing machine, and you know how to prepare meals usually, and what that's all about. But actually, there's not much else, because when you are using standard parenting and you've got a child who's not fearful of adults and trusts adults, you can work with them in the moment. You can say, if you do that, this will happen. And what I realised was that's entirely absent. Children from trauma, my children, they live in the moment. They live on the crashing plane. They're not interested in what happens when the plane has crashed and landed. They're interested in surviving the plane crash right now. There's no bargaining to be done. There's no, if you do that, this will happen. And therefore, it takes away most of your standard parenting tools.
Yeah. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about that later on, and that idea of survival and where that kind of comes from. But just in the kind of looking at across the country now, we're seeing more children struggling with behaviour generally, anxiety, emotional regulation, and we're seeing that more than ever before. Now, presumably not all of these children are from trauma, or maybe there are other forms of trauma, sort of neglect or lack of interaction. But what do you think is going on when we hear about difficult or challenging children, or children who have these labels? And what do you think is being misunderstood, if anything?
There's a few things going on, really. First of all, yes, children who have experienced trauma are kind of a bit invisible, and there's unrealistic expectations around that. Secondly, we've got this whole generation of children where they've experienced gentle parenting. And I'll let you in on a secret. Gentle parenting is no good for children, any child, securely attached or not. All our children need strong boundaries, and they need to learn cause and effect, and they need to know that we as the adults, we are the parents, we're not their friend, although we love them very much, and we put the boundaries in. If you've got a child...
Sorry, the line, I didn't hear that. Gentle parenting is, what did you say, is...
Well, it's not really fit for purpose.
Not fit. Right, well, that's really interesting. And can you define what gentle parenting is?
Yeah, people often confuse gentle parenting with therapeutic parenting, but it's actually very different. Gentle parenting is very much around, using empathy, which is great, identifying with the child, how they feel. That's all absolutely fine. But where it goes wrong is there is much that the boundaries are kind of very soft, and children are allowed to lead rather than follow. So whereas a parent who is using traditional parenting or therapeutic parenting would have clear expectations and boundaries, and you're not to be rude to me, and that behaviour is not okay, and that kind of thing, in gentle parenting there's far too much talking about the child's behaviour. Now, our children need to know where they stand, and they need to feel secure within our boundaries. And what I see in my work is many children who feel quite unsafe and are still trying to work out where the boundaries are. When you add to that the impact of phones and screens on our children's brains, we know that has a real detrimental effect on them, and we're seeing children that are unable to concentrate, that have really serious meltdowns when the screens are taken away, and this all kind of feeds into the same thing. So that's why I think, that's why we're really busy, because we're seeing more and more people reaching out and trying to understand what's going on.
And just for the listeners, you're really busy in your organisation, is that right?
Yes, at the Centre of Excellence in Child Trauma, we do a lot of training with local authorities, schools, social workers, adopters, foster parents, kinship carers. So we do a lot. So we go all over the world, and we do a lot of work with them to help them to understand, when the child is behaving in this particular way, this is why it happens, it's what's going on, and this is how you meet that behaviour. So really kind of what I think of now is basic obvious strategies through therapeutic parenting which help us to understand and the child to understand their own behaviours. It doesn't mean we then say, oh dear, poor you, you've had a terrible time, we're going to make all these allowances for you. My children would describe me as a firm but fair parent, and I think that's right. They always knew where they stood with me.
Can you give some examples of, I've got 2 children myself, and I'm wondering whether they're okay, but whether there was gentle parenting or what, because we don't know really. We don't know. We sort of looked at our parents and felt that we weren't listened to often, or not heard, or unsupervised, perhaps in many cases. So we try and do it differently. But what does it mean when you say that you're being gentle? Does it mean that you are talking about whether they will go out till 12 or 1 or whatever in the morning, or whether they can have a toy when you say they shouldn't because they've got to do something? Just give us some examples.
I'm not the expert in gentle parenting, just speak to somebody about that, but what I see is that with gentle parenting, it's all about how the child feels and all about where they're coming from, with no real consequences for anything that happens, no real boundaries. So, for example, in therapeutic parenting, if a child was to throw something and break it, my response would be, oh dear, that's a shame. I expect you're feeling a bit wobbly about the fact that you've broken that. But then critically, I'm not going to go out and replace the item. That's a shame for you. That is broken now. Do you want me to help you find a way to work out how to get another one? But I'm not going to be buying it for you. So my boundary is that you've broken that, and therefore it stays broken. We use natural consequences when it's safe to do so. We allow the child to experience cause and effect, i.e. their impact on the world, by experiencing the consequences of their actions. That's not to say that if they say, I'm going to run out in the road, that we go, oh, well, off you go, then you're going to get run over. The critical ingredient here is natural consequences with nurture.
Yeah. But if the item was broken by mistake and they were handling it carefully, would you have the same response?
That's different. That's different. If a child is broken, I have to say, I was just sort of racking my brains to think, did that ever happen? Because the difficulty is children from trauma particularly, and those are the only children I've parented, they tend to be quite heavy-handed and clumsy anyway because of the way their brain is developed. So their gross motor and fine motor neuron stuff happens a bit later on. It comes later on. So if one of my children broke something by accident, that's different. I'm going to be like, oh dear, that's broken or that's lost. But then I'm going to help them to sort that out. If my son, for example, I'll show you a real story here, has decided to get a hammer and batter a hole in his bedroom door, unfortunately, there's a hole in your bedroom door, which whilst that looked like a good idea at the time, now everyone can see into your bedroom. So, of course, I'm going to then help him think about how we might like to repair the door. I'm not going to rush out and do it myself. That's the difference, really.
Right, that's interesting. Even though there's a background of trauma and you have to try and understand why they are behaving in that way, or what's happening in the moment, the natural consequences are helping teach them that there will be consequences. Is that the point?
Especially because there's a background of trauma.
Right.
Because in our children's early life, consequences often made no sense. For example, if they were left in a cot and they were hungry and cried and nobody came, then cause and effect didn't link for them. It didn't mean that if I'm hungry, I cry and then somebody comes and soothes me. So they give up crying. So one of the main things that our foster parents, adopters and kinship carers struggle with is our children's inability to link cause and effect. If I do this, that happens. So it's actually a kind thing to allow them to experience it. Do you know what? You do have an impact on the world because you did that. All the things our securely attached children did as toddlers, they've already learned that. It's all hardwired in. But our older children from trauma, they haven't learned that. And it can be, and it's not that you're going to do it once or twice. It can take years for our children to learn that if I do A, B happens. And that's when we know children are really beginning to heal and make changes when they start to link cause and effect and they start to think, oh, I see what happens here. If I do that, that happens. But we're never going to teach them that by telling them. We have to let them experience it. That's what fires up all the neurons in the brain.
You've talked a bit in your book about the sort of loss of empathy or reading other people because there was no one listening to them. Is that something you can help rewire?
Yeah, it just takes a long time. A lot of parents often say to me that are reparenting children from trauma, they often say things like, my child's a psychopath, there's something wrong with him, he's dead behind the eyes. They say things like this because when you've got a 2-year-old who has a lack of empathy, we sort of laugh at that, don't we, really, when you see a 2-year-old, because that's normal, it's developmentally normal. But if empathy hasn't developed because of abuse and neglect, it's not so funny in a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old. It looks quite sinister, but actually all it is delayed development of empathy. That's what it is. And I always say to parents, the way you know that empathy is developing in our children is when they start moderating their own behaviour because of what might happen to them. And I call that empathy for their future self. So, for example, we don't all go off shoplifting in Selfridges or whatever because we might get arrested and it would be bad for us. A child from trauma might go off shoplifting in Selfridges with no idea that something might then happen to them as a result. So when the child starts saying, do you know what, I'm not going to do that, because if I do that, this will happen to me later. That's the beginning of empathy. And that comes before there's empathy for anybody else, but it's much later. So some of my children, I was seeing that around 16, 17, one of my children in her mid-20s. And so it comes really late often. And I think that's particularly challenging for parents.
Yeah, especially when there's other children in the household, potentially, yeah. You mentioned earlier about the damage or the potential damage of screens and phones, and that's kind of very topical at the moment. And I'm just wanting to find out what you think of the government's proposal or consultation on banning social media outright for under 16s. Do bans work? Will they get around it? What do they do at 16? What do you think about that?
I was very lucky that I was in Australia doing some conferences at the time that the legislation was coming in over there, and I met with the e-safety commissioner, and she was explaining to me how they'd done it and what they were putting in place. And I think the critical thing that she said was, you know, there's a lot of people who think that on the day that the social media ban comes in, no under 16-year-old will be able to access social media, and that's completely wrong. It is the beginning of the process. And I think there was a lot of hype around it where people thought that children would be off the internet, they wouldn't be able to access anything, but that's not the case. So I looked into it more. I've joined forces with Health Professionals for Safer Screens, which are quite a big lobby group. They've been informing central government around, the impact of screens. And I've written directly to all the MPs about the impact of screens on children from trauma. The difficulty we have is that all these smartphones, etc., were devised to help us as adults with our fully developed brains to, have an easy life, manage our workload better. They were never intended to be used by children with developing brains. And now we're seeing children under the age of 5 who come to school and can't dress themselves and can't communicate properly because their brain development has been stunted, really. When you add on to that the fact that children are not making relationships and they're looking at their phone all the time, that gets in the way of, it can look like autism. So I've had many people come up to say, I've been told my child has autism, and I say, how was your child's first 5 years of life? Oh yeah, your child doesn't have autism. Take their phone away. And some of the research that's come out in Australia, which is really interesting, talks about, phones and screens being taken away from younger children, and within 5 weeks, they have no symptoms of autism and ADHD. So we're seeing this big explosion, and I know that many children from trauma look like they have autism and ADHD because of the way their brain is developed. And that can be quite unhelpful. And now it's even less helpful because we've got lots of children or lots of parents and professionals saying these children also have ADHD and autism, and it's like a virtual autism and a virtual ADHD. So I'm absolutely pro getting children off social media under the age of 16. I think they shouldn't have smartphones at all. There's lots of different ways that we can track our children and keep tabs on them and keep them safe, and we can always use basic phones. I always look at children now looking at their phone and think their brain is being damaged right now, and it frightens me, really.
You've written to MPs and you're part of the Safer Screen campaign.
Yeah.
Have you kind of produced any, the work on all your observations about autism, is that kind of put into data, or is it your observational experience?
Well, it's interesting because I had noticed it. I'd seen it, and Sarah Dillon, who I work with, who's a therapist, she'd seen it in our practice. But it was only when we started working with Health Professionals for Safer Screens, which is a lot of psychologists and GPs and that kind of thing, that they were kind of saying, yes, this is a thing. This is what we're seeing. This is what we have in our surgeries. These are the kind of... So they have on their website, if anybody wants to look it up, they have got all the research. It's absolutely great. And they've got some really good... PowerPoints and videos with people talking about it in much more detail than I can, because for me it is important and I always make sure parents know about it, but it's a side issue as well for us, because the most important thing for us is about making sure that people understand the impact of trauma on the brain. So that's where we sit, really.
Yeah, and why do you think, or did you say that the traumatized child is more potentially at risk from screen time or protracted screen time? Why is that?
That's because of the dopamine hit. So I know there was this case that was won recently against Facebook in the USA where they were talking about the algorithms and how children were targeted, which has absolutely been my view for a long time. And interestingly, when I used to say it 2 years ago, everyone was like, no, that's not true. And now they're all saying, yeah, we think that is true. So children from trauma, they've missed out on a lot, and they're always looking to escape the uncomfortable memories and the uncomfortable feelings that they have. So they need a lot of distraction, which is why it looks like they have ADHD. It's actually high cortisol levels. And one of the things that helps them manage their cortisol and manage their busyness is dopamine. And when they get in front of a screen and they're scrolling, and there's lots of dopamine hits, so they get addicted to it. So for our children from trauma, they are more vulnerable, and of course that's before you even bring in the possibilities that dangerous birth parents or extended members of the birth family can contact the child, and they're so susceptible. It's exactly like giving a 2-year-old access to the world and say, there you go, look at whatever you want. A lot of our children, they're functioning emotionally at the ages of between 2 and 4, and I just think, personally, I wouldn't be giving a 2 to 4-year-old access to the entire internet. That's the problem. So our children really struggle to tell the difference between reality and fantasy as well. So you can imagine the problems that causes.
But it's not just traumatized children. You think all of under 16s should have access. So I don't want to labour on it. It's very compelling what you said. But my son happened to learn an awful lot of his chemistry. He's now doing a PhD. From YouTube Shorts. And my daughter used to say to me, well, if I'm not on Snapchat, I can't join the party, and no one's out and about anymore because everyone's frightened of whatever paedophiles. How do we connect? And we're very rural. They were very rural growing up, so they wouldn't have had that. Do you not think there are some drawbacks, not to say that there aren't obvious dangers that are well documented?
I think that what's happened is a lot of people have piled it all in together, and there's this misinformation going around that removing social media from our children takes them offline. Well, it doesn't. The children in Australia absolutely can still go on the internet, can still research things. They still have WhatsApp, but what they don't have is the autoplay videos. That's the important thing. So they can still connect to their friends. But what's happening and what we're seeing is they're connecting with friends and then physically meeting up. So you're never going to stop someone having a video and being physically in a room and showing people that, but it stops that autoplay horror videos turning up on our children's phones.
Totally get it. Yeah, we've all struggled with it.
Yes, absolutely.
It's really hard. So you often say behaviour is communication, and are really keen to find out what a child might actually be trying to say when they shout or they withdraw or they push people away, and how one responds to it.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the examples I give about this is, this is a real life thing. Often gets asked, what do I do about my 9-year-old who consistently wakes up in the night and calls out for me, and there's nothing wrong with him, but, my foster child, whatever. And people are often looking for, they might say, look, for goodness sake, I've told you that, you're going to be tired in the morning. And I always say, that's interesting. So tell me, if you had a 6-month-old baby and they were crying in the night, would you go into them and say, now look, I've told you lots of times you're going to be tired. What your child is showing you through their behaviour, they are showing you their unmet need. And if we don't meet that need, it's going to remain unmet for the child's whole life and will lead to all kinds of difficult behaviours. So I always say to people, at what age would you normally expect a child to be crying out 2 or 3 times in the night? And they'll say, well, 6 months, a year, whatever. And what would you do? What would you do for that child? Well, I'd check they're okay. I'd help them go back to sleep. I'd give them some milk. Whatever. I said, That is what we need to do for our children. That is what our children's behaviour is asking us. They can't say, do you know what, Mum? When I was a baby, I was left on my own a lot and I was really scared. They don't know that. We might tell them that. We might say, oh, I see what's happening. I think that, when you were little, you were left on your own a lot and you got really scared. But, I'm here now and we're going to put back in those things. So that's a really simple example of, behaviour as a means of communication. But I often find myself looking at what a child's doing, taking a physical and mental step back and going, what's going on? What's behind it? And that's what therapeutic parenting is, looking behind the behaviour and saying, what's driving that? What's the communication here?
So just to expand on that, would you be able to explain therapeutic parenting just a little bit in more detail? What does it actually mean in simple terms, and why does it matter so much?
So therapeutic parenting is specifically used with children who have experienced trauma, but there are also people who use therapeutic parenting for children with autism who are securely attached. And what therapeutic parenting is, it's a way of parenting where you literally look at what the child is doing, and instead of responding or reacting to that behaviour, you look behind it and you respond to the child. So, for example, if you've told a child specifically not to wear a certain pair of shoes and they come down and saying, I'm wearing these, instead of saying, well, I've told you not to put them on, that's it, I look at the child and think, I think they needed my attention. And I say to the child, I wonder if you thought I was ignoring, I wonder if you were missing me a bit and you needed me to notice you. So we're responding to the child, we're responding to that need that they're showing us. And then we follow that through. So another thing we do afterwards, I'll be thinking about that. I'll be playing it back in my mind and I'll be thinking, did I get that right? Was that what was going on? What might I do differently next time? And do I need to put any consequence? Because sometimes we don't need to put any consequences at all. Sometimes we don't need to link anything at all. And other times we do. Sometimes our children, they feel bad enough about themselves. Their internal working model is full of shame and, I'm not a great person. And sometimes I'm working with parents to say, do you know what? If coming up to their birthday, the child is sabotaging that, the intent, they don't mean it, but the intent there is about, I'm not good enough for a birthday, take my birthday away. We mustn't do it. We say, I see what's going on here. I think that, you don't feel worthy of your birthday. So whatever happens, you're going to have your birthday. However, because you did X, Y, Z, this is going to happen. And we put in a connected, I call it a logical consequence, so that there's boundaries there. Children can't just do anything, but we see the child and we respond to them with empathy.
And when it comes to big blowouts, sort of violent explosions, or some of the things that you must have seen and people worry about, responding with empathy, is that still possible or appropriate?
You can afterwards. You can't, in the moment when there's violence, you've got to stay safe and you've got to keep other people safe. And 9 times out of 10, do you know what? The young person will try to leave, and violence happens when someone tries to prevent them from leaving. So I've counselled quite a lot of parents where they've talked me through an incident that's happened, and the child has had this blow up and I hate you and all that, and then stormed off to their room where there's crashing noises and stuff. And the parents then followed the child. Well, the thing is, the child is dysregulated. The child is in a fear state. It's not a good idea. And it's certainly not a good idea to follow the child, then stand in the door, because the only way out is the door. So we do a lot of work. We run a course called Managing Violent Behaviour, and we explain about this. The child goes, unless you think they're unsafe, they might hurt themselves, we don't need to follow them. We just say, I used to say to my children, I know you're struggling at the moment. I'm here when you need me. I might sit out on the landing. If they've stormed out the house, I might send them a text and saying, I'll put your dinner in the oven. I'll keep it warm for you. So we're keeping that connection, but we're not necessarily like going up against them. The main thing I think that helped me with my children is that I never showed fear. I was frightened of them when they were teenagers and they were very, very aggressive and could be violent. I never showed that fear. And that's difficult, because you've got to be the unassailable safe base for your child. And once they know you're scared of them, you're no longer the unassailable safe base. So, therapeutic parenting is all about being that unassailable safe base and being the person, oh, yes, that's okay. I thought this would happen. Never mind, what we're going to do is X, Y, Z. It's exhausting. It's absolutely exhausting, but it is very worthwhile to do that.
And do you think there are different ways to respond, if like punishments, so that you would have to, you mentioned, I think in your book, about time out and that not being appropriate for traumatized children. Maybe it's not appropriate for any child, but there are things that we do, or seclusion rooms that they have in schools. Just talk a little bit about the consequences. I know you've mentioned consequences that are in the real world and the consequences of natural consequences.
Yeah.
Do you think they are the only consequences we should be looking at, or are there other?
No. Most of the time, what I used to use with my children was what I call extended natural consequences or logical consequences. So I was always looking at ways, because it's so important that we link cause and effect in our children's brains. I'm always looking at, they did that. How can I link back in the consequence? So, for example, if this is a real thing happened, my 15-year-old daughter, her birthday's approaching, so her behaviour gets more and more difficult, more and more challenging, more and more rude, that kind of thing. And I know it's because deep inside her, she doesn't feel worthy of having a birthday. It's a trigger for her. She doesn't know that. She's doing that. So one day this culminates in her trying to jump out of a moving car, right? So I sit her down and I say to her, first of all, I know what's happening here. Even if you haven't got a clue, it's really important to be like, I think I've worked this out. I'm going to have a little bit more to think about it, but then I'll come back to you with it. Unassailable safe base. I know what's happening here. I think that little Katie, not her real name, I think that little Katie doesn't feel that big Katie should have a birthday because she's had such a difficult time. And so little Katie is trying to get me to throw it away. And that unfortunately meant that you, as big Katie, tried to jump out the car. So because that happened, I'll tell you what's going to happen here. Number one, you are not losing your birthday treat. We are doing that no matter what happens. We're doing the birthday treat. But because you tried to jump out of a moving car, that's very unsafe. I'm not driving you anywhere for the next week. We're going to walk everywhere and it'd be very boring, but lots of time for talking. It's something that's within my control. I can definitely control that. That's important as well. So we're linking the consequence to, as closely as we can, to the actual action the child took. Now, I can assure you, for the next, week or so when we're walking about, she was always thinking, this happened because I tried to jump out of a car. Yeah, that we're reinforcing it, and that's what helps them to link cause and effect.
Yeah, wow. But presumably not presumably, do you feel that that's appropriate for any child, not whether they're or not? Yeah.
Yeah, I have grandchildren now and they're all securely attached. It's great that 4 out of 5 of my children can parent. They're great parents. And I use therapeutic parenting all the time, even when I have my grandchildren, because it's just a much easier way to parent, really. And the thing I always can't get over is it works first time every time. With securely attached children, it's like magic. Because I'll say to my granddaughter something like, I wonder if you were feeling a bit wobbly there and you kept interrupting me because you thought I'd forgotten about you and I was talking to your sister. And the child will go, yes, Granny, I was. And I'm like, oh, yeah, they're securely attached. They can feel that in them and they can tell me. With my children, they would have gone, no, idiot. But inside them, they would have realised that is indeed what was happening. So, it's great with securely attached children because they don't have fear of adults.
So we come back to the gentle parenting and therapeutic parenting. I just think it's really important to be very distinct because you're empathizing, you're not punishing in a brutal way or in a way but just what are the key distinctions between gentle parenting and therapeutic parenting?
The key distinction, I think, is around the cast iron boundaries, this unassailable safe base. And these are my rules. This is where we stand. You will not go beyond that. And if you do go beyond that, there are linked consequences to that. We don't use punishment because that doesn't build cause and effect. There's no point in me saying, well, because you were rude to me, I'm taking your pocket money off me. There's literally no point to that. There's no point with any child, but it doesn't build trust, it doesn't build connection. So when schools do things like give a detention for a child next Friday, something they did last Monday, most children would struggle to link cause and effect, but our children from trauma definitely don't. It doesn't change their behaviour, and that's what we want, isn't it? We want to change the behaviour.
But even if you said, well, if you do this, if you go out beyond, I will take your pocket money away, or I'll take your phone or whatever, do you not think that is cause and effect? Because you've warned them that you're going to do something if they do something else. You think you have to really link it so that it actually wires into the brain in a certain way?
No, definitely. Because what you've just described there is it's a good technique with standard parenting, because your securely attached child who's not scared of you can fast forward and think, oh, I won't want to lose my pocket money. But my children aren't going to do that. They're just in the moment of, I want to go out. I'm going to go out now and see my friends spend all this money down the arcade. So they're always on the crashing plane. So there's no point me talking about what will happen when the plane has landed. It's just not there.
Understood.
It's a waste of time.
Now, there's been this big rise, as we mentioned earlier, in diagnosis, ADHD, ADD, autism. Do you feel that we're missing part of the picture when we say that this is just down to phones, or that we're over-diagnosing and that there are people gaming the system to get extra time in exams or whatever it is? We're just very much more wary of it. You know, back in the day, just sort of had children that behaved in certain ways, but we didn't label them. What do you think's going on, and how does that sit alongside trauma as well?
So my son has grown out of autism. It must be the first person in the world. Obviously, he didn't have autism. So my children had 17 different misdiagnoses, and that's really common with children from trauma. So some of the common misdiagnoses that we see as a group of parents are ADHD, ADD, oppositional defiant disorder, which isn't even a thing, autism, sensory processing disorder, dyspraxia. I could go on. However, what that really is trauma, because our children's brains have formed in that particular way. How do you make a relationship with people? How do you learn to communicate if people aren't communicating with you? Of course, my son looked like he had autism. He was absolutely terrified. He was terrified of adults. He wouldn't make eye contact. But now, as a young man, I can assure you, he definitely doesn't have autism. So that's the first thing, is that there's this massive misdiagnosis for any child who is fostered, adopted, kinship care, or living on the edge of care right now. So living perhaps in circumstances that are not ideal. As a social worker, when I look back, I believe that we took action earlier. I don't see that happening anymore. Children are left for too long, and then they're returned to parents who can't parent. And don't get me wrong, some birth parents are great and they turn it around, but the majority of them don't. So they're going back and they're practicing on their children. And of course, we're seeing this escalation, explosion really, in autism and ADHD, etc. But if the children don't have autism and ADHD when they're 25, they didn't have autism and ADHD. What I say to the parents, though, is if the diagnosis helps you, because it did me, you know, my son being diagnosed with autism, it helped because a lot of the symptoms are the same. And so the school worked with him in a certain way, and that was helpful. But with my daughter, misdiagnosed with ADHD, given medication that made her worse, that wasn't helpful. Misdiagnosed with epilepsy, she didn't have epilepsy, she had trauma-based seizures. So we have to think about, you know, is the medication helping or not? Are the structures helping or not? When we then think, as I said, about the impact of phones, I look at my granddaughter staring at her phone, oblivious to what's going on around her. When she's with me, I take it off her.
How old is she? Oh, it doesn't
12.
matter. Oh, yeah.
12.
Okay, so
and my daughter said to me, oh, school have said, you know, that she might have autism. And I'm like, she doesn't have autism. Look at her. You could literally let a bomb off next to her. She's not going to react. She's in her phone. And, you know, so schools now are looking at this and going, oh, the child might have autism, might have ADHD. On top of that, and this is something that people don't talk about, but it absolutely has to be talked about. What is the impact on the 2-year-old, the baby, the 3-year-old, where mum or dad or carers are looking at their phone and they are missing the child's cues all the time? it's the same as neglect. It's the same as emotional neglect. The parent might have drugs or alcohol. They're not responding emotionally to their child. Now, parents don't mean to do that. A lot of them are completely unaware of it. But I sat at a park recently with my grandchildren, not on my phone, watching around, and every single parent was looking at their phone. And I watched this little boy going up the slide and saying, "Mummy," Mummy didn't. And in the end, I watched him pretend to fall off the slide and cry and go, "Ah," because Mummy was looking at the phone. And I think that people underestimate the damage in attachment that also does to our children when they're trying to connect and they can't. And in the end, they just give up, really. It really does mimic some of the abuse that we see.
Yeah. That's so interesting. So would you say, and I don't mean to just sort of oversimplify, that a lot of this explosion, this epidemic of these labels of ADHD and ADD and all these stuff are partly down to phones, both in the children and the adults, and partly down to what would you say? Is there any other thing? I'm just talking generally across the population, just people kind of wanting to get a label to get more...
Yeah. There is more awareness, because I think that when we started talking about this 15 years ago, phones weren't such a big thing, but we were able to bring forward much more of an awareness about, guess what, children that have experienced trauma, neglect and abuse in early life probably don't have these things, but it looks like they do. So we brought that awareness and people started thinking about that and talking about that. So I think that was the start of it. But then, of course, we're seeing in classes now, whereas 20 years ago, there might be one child in 2 or 3 classes with autism. Suddenly, there's 5 in each class. Well, why would that be? When did smartphones come out? 2007. When did we start? You can almost look at the graphs, smartphones.
You don't believe there's any other environmental things or even genetic things? You think it is the smartphone that has really...
I think that's the biggest thing. I think that's the biggest thing, not just smartphones on the child, but on the amount that we as adults are using them as well, and the amount of time our attention is elsewhere. I think that's one of the main factors. I think people are more aware. There is that for sure. People are more aware of autism and ADHD. I could have spoken about autism 15 years ago and people would have said, "Explain to me again what that is." But don't get that anymore. But I do see, this, and it's the same with like anxiety, isn't it? Everything's got a diagnosis now. One of my children said to me recently, "Oh, Mummy, I can't work because I've got social anxiety." And I said, "Do you mean you're shy? This is not a thing. This is not an illness. There's not a tablet for it. It's normal to feel anxious." So I think there's been a bit of over-medicalising of what's pretty normal feelings, really. And that takes away, from our children with trauma. Our children with trauma, they've suffered terribly and they deserve our best care. But if you've got 45 other children in your school with virtual autism from phones, they're not getting it. And it's unfair, I think.
I mean, do you think that the pharmaceutical industry has any part to play in this? Because they help create these labels and decide there's new labels all the time, isn't there? And then medications. Do you think something a bit worrying about that?
100%. And my friend Sarah Dillon, who was a therapist, I work with her a lot. She has children come to her that, she's told, or we think they've got ADHD. And she straight away says, what medication? Oh, they're on this. And she said it's absolutely billions and billions of dollars. And there's a lot of money in it, isn't there? Children have ADHD and they have a tablet and they think it makes it all better. But let's take their phone away first and see if that makes it better.
Well, I think these sort of long-term studies, the Cochrane review found the outcomes were no different after 3 years. But I know that there is, a concentration. They can see the difference in the classroom, but the longer-term outcomes are not different. And then if you think about the side effects, then it's a bit of a worry, isn't it? Yeah, I suppose.
Yeah, you can see, you can definitely see... with my children, they looked like they had autism because they couldn't relate to people. But that wasn't autism. is because they couldn't relate to people. So I think sometimes we've got to be really clear about what we are actually dealing with. And that's my specialist area. That's what I know about. Yeah. I know that if our children have high cortisol, which nearly all children from trauma have, high cortisol because they're always on the crashing plane, it looks exactly the same as ADHD. And I have had senior psychiatrists say to me, we cannot tell the difference. There is not a test that shows us if it's ADHD, if it's high cortisol. It looks exactly the same.
It's difficult when the symptoms are the same, and one could argue, well, if the drugs help and the label helps, what does it matter?
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I'd agree that my daughter, although I talk about my children, I run 2 therapeutic fostering agencies, and so we've dealt with hundreds, if not thousands of children over the years, and this is the general pattern, and that's the big if, isn't it? Usually, for children with high cortisol from trauma, the medication for ADHD does not make any difference at all. And one of the ways I first learned that was that with my daughter, she used to take Ritalin or whatever for school days, but guess what? We didn't need it in the holidays. So we only had term time ADHD, and that's because we managed it through boundaries, routine and structure. So it wasn't ADHD, of course.
Yeah. What do you think are the most common mistakes that even a calm, well-meaning parent could make when dealing with the most difficult behaviour? I know we've touched on the gentle parenting and the lack of balance, but are there other mistakes that you think that people are making?
When we're looking after children from trauma, I think that sometimes it's about, changing things. So, for example, it's about saying things that can't possibly be true. Like, for example, if you do that, that will happen. Or if you're rude to me, la, la, la. And when you do that, you become unsafe for the child. And we do that because in the moment we don't pause. That's one of the first things we do in therapeutic parenting is we just pause for a second or maybe a bit longer and we think, hang on a minute, what's going on here? Because if we don't do that, we like to say, right, that's it, you're grounded for a month. Well, A, there's no point to that, and B, do you really want the child grounded for a month? So that's one of the things, when we are going emotionally and we're responding emotionally to the situation, rather than having a little pause and thinking about what's going on here, that's when we make mistakes. And that's when we say things that we don't really mean to say, because one of the things we have to do in therapeutic parenting, we have to mean what we say and say what we mean. So I learned to be very, very careful. So, for example, I couldn't ever say to my children, we'll go to the park later, because if it was absolutely tipping it down with rain in the afternoon, and I said, we won't go, it's raining, they'd say, you lied to us, and I have become an unsafe adult. So, for a lot of reasons, therapeutic parents tend to wait and see, and then they go, right, in an hour, we're going to do this, so it's definitely going to happen. I would never say we might do this or maybe that will happen. We have to be very definite and very clear.
You've talked about understanding the shame that children from trauma feel, and then understanding the mindset of why that little girl wanted to throw herself out of the car and why they don't deserve a birthday. Are there other key things that one needs to understand when one's trying to unpick behaviours and sort of, relate them and then their behaviour, react appropriately? Shame is one.
Yeah, fear. Our children are terrified. And even, social workers used to say to me, well, I'll tell you this, it's a good analogy, it's in the A to Z. So I always say my children were born on a plane, and unfortunately their plane was flown by unsafe pilots, unskilled pilots. We don't know why they're unskilled, but they just were. And it meant they're falling about in the plane, they're not strapped in, they never know when their food is coming. And then one day, a social worker comes along and says, well, this is a very unsafe plane. I'm going to move you to Sarah Naish's plane because she's a good pilot, she can parent. Just because you move the child into my safe plane, the trauma comes with that child. So sometimes as a social worker, we would make the mistake of saying, you can go and live with Sally and John. They're great foster parents. They've looked after loads of children. The child's thinking, well, where are they then? Have they killed them? That's what's happening. And the work I do with social workers is I say to them, the trauma comes with the child, and the only way I'm going to make my children feel safe is I've got to land that plane hundreds and hundreds of times. I've got to show them I can parent, I've got to show them I can be consistent, and I've got to land the plane. And that is the way that the neurons will form, their cortisol will come down, and they'll start going, do you know what, I think mum's got this. And my oldest daughter was 17 when she said that to me, and she'd been with me for 9 years. And at that point she said, I think you can parent. So that was a relief.
Wow, I don't know how you do. You must have, well, you did talk about compassion fatigue. Maybe we'll just touch on that, but just the need to self-care, isn't it? Which doesn't mean just sort of going for a 3-day spa, but just a little bit about that, just for people who are just sort of struggling.
Yeah. So when I was bringing up my children, when they're all teenagers, sometimes a social worker would come around and say really unhelpful things like, oh, you need to have a break, or you need a bit of self-care. And I can assure you, if any adopter, foster parent, kinship carer hears that, they just sigh inwardly because they're like, well, yeah. And I used to just, because I didn't care anymore, I used to say to social worker, oh, great, are you going to look after the children then while I nip off and have a little? And they'd be like, well, no. And I said, well, how am I going to have that break? How am I going to do that? So I stopped talking about self-care, and now I talk about essential maintenance, because if you don't look after yourself, if you don't do the bare minimum, you cannot carry on, and then you cannot meet your children's needs, let alone your own. So because I ignored my overwhelm, which is, it was overwhelming. My life was very, very difficult. I had 2 strokes when my children were teenagers. I literally lost the power of speech for a week, which my husband was probably quite pleased about. And it was because I didn't listen. I didn't listen to my body. Now, since then, I've got much better at going, do you know what? When I go to Sainsbury's later, I'm just going to stay half an hour more in the cafe and sit there, stare into space and have my coffee. You've got to take it because nobody will give it to you.
Wow. So it can be just little bits of time, just to implement to yourself with no interruption is kind of key. Yeah. So there's something in the book that I picked up about the difference between a child who can't behave and one who won't behave, and the distinction between those. Can you just explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'll give you my little penguin analogy. So, penguins have wings. But if you take that penguin to the top of the cliff and throw them off, no matter how hard they flap their wings, they are not going to be able to fly. They want to, it's not that they won't, it's that they can't. And in the same way, our children's brains have formed in a different way. And you can see brain scans of children from trauma, and you can look at all the bits that aren't working, the hippocampus where memories are all mixed up, cause and effect isn't linked. You can see all that happening. The amygdala is in charge, so it's lots of cortisol and lots of overwhelm. You can actually see that, but of course it's hidden. Our children are really good at masking. They're really good at looking like survivors. So the teachers would say to me, well, William was very rude today and he wouldn't sit there and do his work. He wouldn't sit still and do his work. And I said, it's not because he won't, it's because he can't. His cortisol levels are high. They drive him to move. He has to move. And we've got to reframe this. We're not looking at a 2-year-old and saying, well, that 2-year-old was very naughty. They took a banana. From the supermarket, we need to phone the police. I mean, just need a reality check here, really.
So the other kind of question that probably is in a lot of people's minds, children who've had a really difficult start, which you've seen many, many times, do you believe that they can really, truly, fully recover or recover to almost, a large extent? And what does that look like over time? How long does it take? Yeah.
It looks like at least 10 years of therapeutic parenting. It looks like a lot of helping the child to unpick their past and work out, well, you behave like this because this happened to you. I think that you're doing that because when you were little, it's about giving them a different narrative. So rather than them thinking, I'm a bad person, I steal things, they've got a narrative of, oh, yeah, when I was little, I was often hungry. So I still feel driven to take things. And that's because of what happened to me when I was young. And I've got to remember, I don't need to do that anymore. but they can't change their behaviour unless we give them that. I call that naming the need and explaining it to them. When we use that with our children, their internal working model changes. They change their view of themselves. So it means that you can't eradicate the trauma. What happened, but they make sense of it and they go, oh, I feel like this because. So, for example, when my children were in their early to mid-20s, if they got a really annoying phone call, instead of them going, oh, I can't believe it, this happened, they'd say, oh, my cortisol levels are really high now because somebody said, so I need to go outside and run up and down a little bit. And I go, okay. So they've got the tools. They know why they react the way they do, and they know what to do. So I say 4 out of 5 of my children are successful parents. One of them won't be able to because of inherited mental health conditions, and all their children are securely attached. So yes, but we get there a different way. We don't go the standard parent route. We've got to get a circuitous route. It's a different path and it's a longer path, but it's very rewarding.
Yeah, it sounds like a very communicative and very honest one as far as you can be, yeah.
Yes.
What role does love play in all of this? It might be very difficult to feel love for a dysregulated child that is not from your own family. And is that on its own even enough,
I'll tell you what I think gets hard is when you are looking to your children to be your reward. And I always say, do you know what? It wasn't in my children's job description to get born, get abused, get moved, be rewarding. It's not in their job description. It's up to me as the parent to find things that are rewarding. So I can look at my children's lives now and find reward in that. I find reward in the fact that they are great parents. I find reward in the fact that they are empathic and kind. Are they always kind to me? No, but it isn't about me. It really isn't about me. My children have got to work through their trauma. And I think that that's how we have to look at it, really. It's about, what are you doing this for? When I started my adoption journey, I wanted to be a mum and have a lovely family. And now I talk to people and I say, look, you can do that. However, learn about attachment, learn about trauma. You've got to do therapeutic parenting. And it's a really hard, tough journey. I always say therapeutic parenting is the hardest, most worthwhile thing you'll ever do in your life.
Well, you mentioned their attachment, which we hear a lot about, but what does secure attachment look like? And for families where not everyone agrees on how to parent, how do you bring everyone on board? And what happened with the attachment for the traumatized child, and how do you bring it back?
So people often like to talk about different attachment styles, and I've always steered clear of that. And the reason I steer clear of this is because the many children that I've worked with, they have different attachment styles and it changes throughout their life. So they might have what they call disorganized attachment, which is where, they're quite reactive and they don't connect to people. But then a year later, you might find that they have a different attachment style. So I talk in terms of developmental trauma. All children in the care system have developmental trauma. There's not a way around that. There's been some kind of rupture, always. And that's what therapeutic parenting does, is it helps to heal the children from their trauma. Now, obviously, I wanted my children to attach to me. I wanted to grow secure attachments. And what that looked like really was landing that parenting plane lots and lots of times in order for them to learn to trust me. Now, I would say my children do trust me. In fact, funnily enough, even just this afternoon, something's happened where one of my children's been contacted by a birth family member. 3 of them have contacted me and said, Mum, what should I do about this? Well, they wouldn't be asking me if they didn't trust me. They'd just go off and do it. But that trust was very, very hard won because it's not there at the start. It just isn't. You've really got to work hard and just keep going and be the same and be predictable and reliable. My friend calls it consistency, CPR, consistency, predictability, reliability. And it's tiring, but very needed.
Yeah, you mentioned, I think, banging your head against a brick wall at one point. It just keep going and keep going, keep being consistent. But in the nation, if you could change something about how we do support children and families, what do you think, what do you wish more people understood, and what do you wish, even at a governmental level, we could do to help children who are labelled as difficult or...
Yeah. the one thing we should do, which would make a huge difference, we should make sure that all social workers that are going to work in children and families are trauma informed, and that there is a good module within their training which explains to them exactly what I've been talking about today, why our children behave differently, where that behaviour comes from, and more importantly, what you can do about it. Because otherwise we're going to carry on having thousands and thousands of foster parents leaving because they say the social worker doesn't get it, and they're right. We don't, in our fostering agency, we don't lose foster parents. We've got 98% stability, and that's because they know we get it. But out there in local authority, foster parents leave because they just feel that they're unheard, because they have people going around saying, well, have you tried this, and get out a reward chart. It won't work. But it's not the social worker's fault. They're also not trained. If they had trauma-informed training, they'd be giving the correct advice to foster parents, adopters, and kinship carers, and they would actually feel empowered and they would have better relationships. That one thing would absolutely alter the face of fostering, certainly, and adoption in this country.
How long has trauma-informed parenting been recognised, and how widespread is it used in social work or in the social work training? I mean, is it a relatively kind of last decade, or is it not novel? No.
I started talking about therapeutic parenting or trauma-informed parenting 15 years ago, as I got to the point where my children were old enough for me to be able to talk about it. And at that point, people were not listening, and they were quite defensive and angry about it. Once I'd written the A to Z of therapeutic parenting, that had such a big positive impact. Since then, I've been pushing an open door, really. And many social workers, foster parents, adopters that I meet say, we've read it, we look at it, they use it as a quick reference chart, which is great. And that's what changed it, I think, for me. That made it become quite current and quite mainstream. So, yeah, I'd say last sort of 10 years, we've seen the big changes. And we do quite a lot of work with many different local authorities. Some local authorities are really great. They really embrace it. They get that it changes everything. It doesn't have to cost them anything. And there are other local authorities that literally got their fingers in their ears going, la, 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 we've always done it this way. And we're like, yeah, that's right. You've got 50% of your foster parents leaving. There's a clue there. But we will get there. We give free training now to local authorities. Our companies are all not-for-profit, and we give free training to social workers, universities. We're doing everything we can to try to get people, schools and social workers, trauma-informed. I think it's so important for our children.
Yeah, I was going to bring up schools as well. Is there a big shortfall in the number of schools that are really understanding this?
Yeah, there has been a shift. There has been a bit of a shift. And my team wrote the A to Z of trauma-informed teaching 2 years ago. And they are people who have run schools and changed schools from normal state schools into trauma schools. So they really know what they're talking about. And I think, again, that has helped schools to start looking at that and going, okay, maybe we need to do this differently. So there's a seed change happening. The growth of farm schools, we see that. An adopter that I met yesterday said, my child goes to a really great trauma school, which is farm-based, and they've based everything on the A to Z of trauma-informed teaching, which is helping all those children there. So we are seeing that, but it is a bit of a lonely place sometimes. We do feel like trailblazers and pioneers, and we are, but it would just be good if we could have more people alongside us as we go. I think I might be dead by the time it's mainstream.
Like you have so much energy. But are there any other countries that have got this right? One often looks abroad. Do you think?
Yeah, we go all over the place. It's really interesting. So when you go to small countries like Malta and Iceland, Estonia, they will take what we talk about, because we've not only got what we know, we've also produced lots of tools, because I know what it's like being a social worker and how time-consuming it is. So we've produced lots of tools which really help streamline things. And those countries sort of take our stuff on and embrace it wholeheartedly, because they're only really the size of a local authority. So Estonia, for example, has changed the way they assess foster parents, because they use our method now, because it means people are properly prepared. When I went to Australia last year, people were literally sitting their mouths up and saying, this is amazing, this is what we need. So we're going back to do a tour this October. We're doing 3.5, 4 weeks there. So they're sort of right at the beginning of their journey, but they're really, really open to it. And there's other countries like France, where there's nothing happening. So, I find it quite interesting. Yeah, it's
absolutely fascinating. And we've run out of time, unfortunately. It's been absolutely, even though I've read your books, I've learned a lot. And I really love to thank you so much, Sarah Naish, for joining us today for a fascinating and really insightful conversation. If you'd like to hear more episodes, explore upcoming live events, or access free resources, you'll find all the links in the episode description. Just scroll down wherever you're listening.